Well, welcome to everybody from Cynthiana, Kentucky. And hi, Miss Cindy. How's everybody down there today? It's a beautiful day here in Pincher Creek, Alberta. And I'm hoping that Miss Cindy has told you a little bit about our Pioneer Village. We're a museum in a little town in Canada, and I'm going to show you exactly where we are. Now unfortunately this map doesn't show where you are in Kentucky, but here is northern Ohio. In fact, here is Cleveland. Okay, so that should give you an idea. Here is Indiana, and here's Pennsylvania. So I'm thinking you're down here on this board somewhere on the Ohio River. We are way over here in the western part of Canada, right here. In fact, I can see it right in the corner. It says Pincher Creek, and it's right in the Rocky Mountains. In fact, where I'm standing right here today, I can see the tops of the Rocky Mountains, and they've got snow on them. Can you believe we just had snow here on the 1st of July? Well, we do. Now, if I was to go to your town in Kentucky, and I haven't been to Cynthiana, but I have been to Covington, and I've been to Maysville, and I've been to Cincinnati. So I've been pretty close. I've been about half an hour away from you. Unfortunately, I didn't know Mr. Chris and Miss Cindy back in those days, so I didn't visit them. But if I ever come back and finish my trip from Cincinnati to Louisville, you can bet I'm going to be stopping at Cynthiana. So if I was to go to your town, I would have to go into the state of Montana, near Glacier National Park, and I would get on the Amtrak train and I would go all the way across Montana, and that's a long ways. Believe me, no trees, nothing. North Dakota, more trees, no nothing. And then we'd go through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then we'd go all the way down to Illinois, to Chicago, and then we'd probably take the train down to Cincinnati, down here. I never looked that up what that is in miles, but I do know it takes about 2.5 days on the train. A little easier on the plane. I've never flown that, so that gives you an idea.
Hi everybody, I'm Isabel, and I'm one of the museum's assistants here at Kootenai Brown Pioneer Village. And today I get to talk about a few of our buildings here. This one's one of my absolute favorites. It's our Fishburne School, our one-room country schoolhouse. As you can see, we got our lovely Pioneer desks in here.
Keep talking though.
Now for this, it's not quite like school as you know it, where you get your one grade, everybody's in it, all the same ages. But in this schoolhouse, the teacher would have up to 30 students from grades 1 through 8. It didn't mean everybody was in one class. It meant you could have 2 grade 3s, 1 grade 8, and it just kind of varied depending on who could go to school, depending on what they had to do with chores on the farm. Now, an important part of our school, we're from 1894. So we have this flag. This is our Union Jack. This is for Great Britain, because up until the 60s, Canada didn't have a flag. So when we sang our national anthem, we saluted this flag with Queen Victoria. Now up here, we have our encyclopedias. I can't imagine having to carry these around all day, looking through them, trying to find answers to my school homework, but this is what we had to use in our Pioneer School. It's kind of like our Wikipedia of today, which is so much easier. Definitely makes finishing those last couple of questions much more helpful. So today's a nice sunshiny day here in Pincher, but it's often kind of cold, really cold some days. So our Pioneer stove was really important. Now as the teacher, I don't have time to get all things ready for all of the different students. So this was a job for some of the older kids in grade 7 or grade 8. They'd get to chop some firewood, get it ready for us.
You mean they would let people in grade 8 use an axe?
I know, this seems a little crazy,
Wow.
but Little House on the Prairie did it, so I feel like we're okay, right? That makes it
So
fun.
when did the school bus drop you off?
School buses, that's No, if you ask anybody, you walked 5 miles uphill, both snow, no matter what time
Underwater.
of year it was.
In the wind.
But sometimes, if you were lucky, your parents let you use their horse that you had on the farm. But you had to treat that horse really carefully, or else you'd end up walking back to school. So when you go for lunch, the first thing you do before you dive into whatever you got in your milk crate that day, you gotta feed your horse. You gotta make sure your horse has water, lots of food, and if you don't, your teacher's gonna write a nasty letter home to your parents. Can you show me the strap?
Yeah, and I don't know how Miss Cindy treats everybody out down there in Kentucky.
We got a few punishments for our Pioneer students if they didn't want to listen. So if they were misbehaving in class and didn't want to pay attention, sometimes they'd get to wear the dunce cap. All the other kids get to have a real nice laugh at whoever has to wear it. Other times, you get to stand up at the front of the chalkboard, facing the chalkboard while everybody else does everything. But if you're really not paying attention to what the teacher's saying, you get the strap. Thankfully, we don't use it in school anymore, but Pioneer times, this is what the teacher gave up if you're being especially bad. Plus, your teacher would probably write a note home for your parents, and you'd probably get something similar at home too. So we try not to cause any rule breaking here in our Pioneer school, but we do our best to follow along. Now, on a sunny day like this, we're probably all thirsty in class. I know I always get thirsty when I'm in class. So this is our very, very fancy water fountain. I think it's 5-star rating here.
Oh yes, looks healthy and cleanly.
Oh, definitely. So if somebody was thirsty, you'd come get the water bucket, and then you'd have a stick. Now, what's in the bucket?
Well, nothing right now, but I'm betting that there would be water in it.
But we only have one ladle.
Well, I guess everybody's going to have to drink out of the same ladle, out of the same bucket.
So people got sick a lot, which is why, especially now, we can't really share things anymore like that. Aren't we glad we have water bottles nowadays?
Yeah. Now, this is probably like Old West times, right? When you said a little house on the prairie? Yeah, so the one-room country schoolhouse, it probably disappeared pretty quickly, didn't it?
Oh, this one lasted up until the 60s.
1963.
Yeah. So it depended on where you were, because most of the schools did eventually come into town, but this one did last for almost,
You can imagine.
5 years.
So like it saw the turn of the 20th century, it saw World War I, World War II, Korea, and right into the early 1960s. So about the time John F. Kennedy was president in the United States, that's when this school closed. So it was a very, very long time school, 1894 to 1963. Okay, I'm just going to show them a little picture of what the Fishburne School looked like from the outside back in the day. And you can see the chimney. By this time they actually had a chimney, so that they had a bit of a furnace in here, but Miss Isabel was right. They did have the potbelly stove for heating. And it doesn't look like much, that stove, but I'll tell you, it really works. And you can see the snow on the roof. Of course, we're in Canada, so we get snow, but Pincher Creek tends to be a little warmer than most places in Canada, but we pay for that. We get a lot of wind. As a result, roofs don't last very long and chimneys don't last very long, because our winds can be howl, something fierce. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little idea of what it looks like going to the outside, and then we'll show you the outside of the school, what it looks like today as it sits in the village. I wanted to show you some pails here. This is your lunch kit. Look at that, Rogers Golden Syrup. Well, that's a syrup that everybody bought. And over here we have Alberta Pure Honey. And sometimes the pails would be made out of lard or ketchup pails and things like that. And that was your lunch kit. So it was sort of like recycling. Here's a picture of some children in front of the Fishburne School. And now I believe we'll go outside. We'll show you where the water came from that Miss Isabella showed you. And this is running water. What that means is you run to the pump and you get it, and then you run back inside. So you actually had to pump it by hand. And we can show you that. Oh, we even have some water in there right now. Now it's not working today, but we do have some water in here because it's rained a lot here a couple of days ago. But if back in the day, once that pump caught prime, that water bucket would fill. Okay. Kootenai Brown, as I was saying, was a frontiersman. If you ever heard of a man named Buffalo Bill Cody, Kootenai Brown was kind of Canada's version of him. He was a hunter, trapper, a gold miner, and he was actually from Ireland and came to the United States first. He came to Panama and then to San Francisco, and he worked his all the way up the mountains until he got into this area, Pincher Creek. And he ended his life, he was a park ranger, and he founded a national park that you can visit today called Waterton Lakes National Park. And that park is right on the border with one of your American parks, Glacier National Park in Montana. In fact, the two parks together make an international peace park. So that's sort of like the United States and Canada decides, you know what, we're not going to fight any wars with each other anymore over the border, and they formed the peace park to kind of cement that bond. And it's right in the Rocky Mountains of Canada. And I don't think we can see too many mountains from the village today, but well, I'll try to give that a try, see if we can get on top of a building and show you some mountains. If not, I'll maybe take a drive. So Isabel is standing in front of the cabin right now. And I'll just show you. He had several cabins within the park. Now, why did he have so many buildings? Well, as I said, he was a hunter and a trapper, and being in the mountains, sometimes you never know when you're going to get into a snowstorm. So he would always know where he was at within the mountains. Why did he hunt so much? Well, basically he hunted to make money. He was a fur trader, and he would trade those furs at certain places, and then he would and also fish and sell the fish also to people who wanted to, well, eat fish. And the furs would be sold to make coats and also to make leather for boots and belts and all sorts of things. And Kootenai Brown also had a wife, and we're going to go inside, and Isabel is going to tell you all about Kootenai Brown's wife, because she was just about as fascinating as Kootenai Brown himself.
He was married originally to a Métis woman named.
So there's a picture of Kootenai and his wife, and you're going to say, geez, Ranger Gord, what's his name? I'm sure his name wasn't wife. Her name wasn't wife. Actually, she had 4 names, and Isabel's going to talk to you about that right now.
So in this picture we have Kootenai Brown and his second wife, Michi Moose. His first wife was named Olivia, and they had 3 children together. But unfortunately, Olivia passed away when she was quite young. So when Kootenai Brown and his kids moved to the Waterton area, fortunately he was not able to take care of his children the same way he really wanted to. So his children were given over to Father Lacombe and given into his care. We learned about Father Lacombe earlier in the Hermitage. But Michi Moose, the woman in this picture, like Gord said, she did have 4 names. Now, she was a Cree woman.
I'll give you the Cree name first. Her name in Cree Chipe Takwa Kakasun. And that is her name in her own language.
Which translates into English into blue flash of lightning, which I think is really, really cool. Most people, however, called her Isabella, which I also think is cool since my name is Isabel. But to Kootenai Brown, he called her his Nietzsche Moose, or his sweetheart, which, absolutely adorable. We love a good romance. I mean, Gord doesn't, but I do at least.
Ooh, romance, yucky girl stuff.
And Nietzsche Moose was a fierce woman. Just because she was called sweetheart and darling doesn't mean she sat around, didn't help out at all. She was really smart and very fierce lady. She helped with hunting, cooking, cleaning, tanning, and curing hides. So she did a really important job. And Kootenai Brown and Nietzsche Moose, while they worked in the area, she was a really big part of, as Gord said, what would eventually become Waterton National Park. She helped him with his petition to make Waterton into a national forest reserve, which was its first step to being the beautiful national park that we know it today. They lived together for 20 years until Kootenai died, and Nietzsche Moose lived on for another 18 years in the Waterton area. And we're
in the main parlor of Nietzsche Moose and Kootenai Brown's cabin. And I'm just going to pan down a little bit here. This is Kootenai's office, where he liked to read, and also you can see a typewriter. And Kootenai had to write a lot of letters in his job in being park ranger. In fact, it was his work in writing to the government of Canada in Ottawa that helped to get the park saved. Originally it was called Kootenai National Park, which would have been really interesting because it almost would have been named after him, but somebody decided to name it Waterton instead. And I don't think Kootenai minded. He just wanted to make sure that the natural beauty of the area was preserved. So within the national park, we can't mine, we can't hunt, and we can't drill for oil either, which is really interesting because amongst Kootenai Brown's exploits was he actually did find the first oil well in Alberta. Now, in Kentucky, maybe you don't understand what that means, but it's a big deal in Canada and Alberta because it has made Alberta the provider of a lot of energy for all of Canada and even in the United States and in Asia as well. Oil. When he found the oil, nobody even knew what to do with, and all he did was he went out with a bunch of sacks and rags and he squeezed it into bottles and he sold it to farmers to use for axle grease for their wagons. Nietzsche Moose and Kootenai's bedroom, and just show you some of the things that are in here. Now, as we said, Kootenai was a hunter, so you can see as a blanket he's using things like beaver pelts and a black bear fur. Over here we have a buffalo coat made out of, as I said, a buffalo. So let me pan up and down. There's a caribou on the wall up here, which actually is an animal from northern Alberta. We generally don't have caribou in the southern part of Alberta. There's a scary bear. Rawr! Boy, I don't want to meet that guy in a dark alley. Okay, Isabel, I think if you could turn the lights on again. Now, a guy like Kootenai you wouldn't think would be much of a reader, but in fact he was. He loved to read. And in fact, people would talk about visiting him and they'd see the works of Shakespeare and such in there. And he also liked to think a lot, so he read the Bible a lot and did a lot of writings to people about his life. Here's a picture with Kootenai Brown is with the Chief Ranger of Glacier National Park, a man by the name of Mr. Reynolds. Now, if you ever heard of something called the Little Bighorn and the battle with where Custer fought Sitting Bull, Kootenai Brown knew a lot of those people. In fact, Kootenai had one time had been captured by Sitting Bull, and he had also met General Custer as well at one time. This Mr. Reynolds in here was the father of a scout that was killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn by the name of Lonesome Charlie Reynolds. Now, Kootenai got into some scrapes over his time, And at one point, he ended up murdering a guy with a knife. And he almost got hung in the state of Montana over that. And that's one of the reasons he came across to Waterton Lakes National Park, because they told him to pretty much get out of the United States. And now we'll go into the kitchen here. And some of these items actually did belong to Kootenai Brown and to Nietzsche Moose. Mostly kitchen items that you might find. Frying pans. I believe there's a sausage stuffer over here. Yeah, if you enjoy sausages, well, you might not want to know how it's made. But this is how they would make their game, like their deer and such, into sausages. And that would help to preserve it, so they would have it all year long, not just for 1 or 2 meals. So there is the stove, and that is a wheelchair. It looks a little different from wheelchairs that you might know of today. And after Kootenai Brown died in 1917, Nietzsche Moose lived for about 20 years after. And in the years, her aging years, because of all the hard work that she had done, she needed a wheelchair to be moved around in. And she moved in with the Riviere family. And they helped her in her advancing years. This guy. That is a golden eagle. And if I was to bring him down and hold my arm straight out, I couldn't touch the ends of his feathers. It's almost 8 feet from wingtip to wingtip. And Alberta is home to a lot of birds of prey. In fact, so I think that's it for inside the cabin here of Kootenai Brown. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll move on to another site.
So we're going to the Arthur Edgar Cox house. And this is probably, depends on the day, maybe my favorite building. I know I said the school was, but this one's absolutely gorgeous inside. And he does play an important role with the school too. So why don't you guys come on and follow me and we'll head inside. So Arthur Edgar Cox was born in England, was born and raised there. Then he decided to travel, first to New York and Staten Island. That wasn't enough for him. He was teaching there for a little bit. Then he sailed around, went down through Panama, wanted to see Australia for a couple of years, but wasn't enjoying the sheep down there, so he decided to hop on another boat and see what was next. Now, unfortunately, like our weather yesterday and all week basically besides today, A. Cox's ship had a little snag and there was a massive...
We were just going to give you a good shot of the banjo here.
So after the storm, the ship was completely off course, shipwrecked on an island. Now this island was not empty. It had a number of inhabitants who might have been cannibals, but Arthur Edgar Cox was smart and he was talented. Now he made a banjo from the boat and decided to play. He thought, well, I'm going to do something that I love. It might be my last day on Earth with the cannibals running around, so I'm going to play some pretty music. The music was so nice that the cannibals stopped what they were doing and then let them go. I wish I was able to do that because that just sounds like a really good time. If you're that talented that cannibals are going to leave you alone, that's got to be pretty special. But after that, he decided maybe travel's not the thing he wanted to do. So after their ship left, he ended up in Manitoba for a while, hopped on a train, coming this way. When he got to town, the Creek, our lovely little town, was looking for a school teacher. So he hopped on a wagon and headed west and came into town. And like I said before when we were outside, it does have a connection to the school. Not that particular schoolhouse, but he was our first school teacher here in town. He was also our first minister. He got a piece of land where he built this beautiful house, and he and his wife raised 11 children. We have a photo of the whole family.
11 children.
I know.
Wow.
I think it's bad. I have 2 siblings, and fighting over the last cupcake is bad enough. Could you imagine having 11 people that you're in a very tight space with?
This house is big, folks, but it's not that big.
Really?
So I think they had them over a number of years. So some of the olders had already moved out, and some of the younger ones came along. But families tended to be really, really big in those days. Let's go see the kitchen, because this is an amazing kitchen. There's a dining room and a kitchen, so they would eat and prepare food in different rooms. And just look at the elaborate china here.
I always just like coming in here because we see the differences. We saw how big Kootenai Brown's cabin was from we're in Waterton, and that was a large cabin for its day. And then we see almost the opulence of the house here with the china, and even its size wasn't very common for its day. But I think that's really interesting just to see the differences from its era.
Now we're going to go into the working kitchen here, and look at this.
Does your parents' stove look like this?
I don't think so. There's no microwave in here.
This looks familiar though, Gord.
Now this is cow country, so this is home on the range. Now this is a wood-fired stove. See, so if you got to a certain age, you would get to play with the axes, and you would make sure that there was always wood around to burn in the stove. And if you didn't, well, guess what? You go hungry. There's a waffle iron, like Isabella was showing you, and there's even a dishwasher. Take a look at this on the side. This is a water tank for water, so you would always have hot water to be able to do the dishes. And boy, they must be fancy. They have their pump handle, and you would be able to pump your water in there. There would be like a little sump under the house on this side of the house that you could pump from, and that would be pretty fancy work. Now what we're seeing over here is a cream separator. I don't know, everybody here in this group likes milk, but these people actually milked their own cows, and they would separate the cream from the milk. And the way this works is scientifically. Somebody would have to turn that big handle, and as it turned the handle, the cream would turn and turn and turn, and as it turned, the cream and the milk would want to separate. So the milk would go in one bucket out the spigot, and then the cream would go in another bucket. And of course the milk you drank, the cream, well, that would be made into other things like butter and cheese and ice cream.
You scream.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Does the Cox house have a laundry room? There we go, we have a laundry room. It's right here in the kitchen. And kids, boy, if you don't have anything to do someday, well, you can help Mom with the laundry, and you can turn that great big wheel. And as you turn the wheel, you'll have the water and all the laundry, and then inside there is no cords. You're doing this by your hand. Is churning along with the soap. And when it's done, then you have to go over to this. This is the wringer. Has anybody ever heard you're get put through the wringer? Well, that's where that term comes from. And you would have to squeeze the moisture and all the water out of your wet laundry and put it through the wringer. And then you take it to the dryer. Do you know where the dryer is, kids? It's outside. Yes, it's on a rope. And as we said, what happens in Pincher Creek? We get lots of wind. And because we get lots of wind, things dry out really, really fast.
If they don't blow away first.
Yeah, if they don't blow away. And we're in a special room off the kitchen. It's called a pantry. And this helped to keep produce from rotting. And it also was a place to store all of the different implements that you had. like pots and pans and bread bowls, coffee. I think the light is on good. I don't think we'll go upstairs. But this is sort of the parlor. We were in another parlor before. I would imagine what Mr. Cox would probably have one for where the adults sat, like when company came over, and the children were not allowed to come into there. Here is the front parlor, and then this is the back parlor. This is probably more the kids' play area. As long as they were quiet. They were supposed to be seen and not heard. I like to have pictures of their relatives, and look at nice big oval pictures. And paintings of the Rocky Mountains. In Canada, we were a very, very big part of World Wars I and World War II. Trooper G.F. Cox, he enlisted in World War I. Came back from what they called the European War. Now the Coxes were also ranchers. Now the Coxes didn't have a lot of cattle, but there was a lot of work to do for all of these children. Boys or girls, you learned to ride a horse, and you learned to ride and to rope. I'm just going to show the staircase. We're not going to go right upstairs. Oh, you know, I don't know about going upstairs here. Have you heard stories about why I shouldn't?
I've heard a couple, but...
Can you tell them to me? I'm going to put my hat over my ears. You can tell the camera, though.
Some of our visitors tell us that upstairs might be a little bit haunted. But it's okay. When we leave, I always make sure to say, have a good day, and they stay up there. I haven't seen them, but I know some people in some of the upstairs windows, they think they see a curtain move, which I don't want to run into a ghost today, Gord. I don't think they do either.
I think it would be a friendly ghost. I think we'd have more of the Casper than the Spectre.
That's true.
I don't want to run into the Spectre. Yeah, he's a little judgy.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed the Cox home, and this is one of the nicer pioneer homes that we have here on the village. Yeah! Welcome, boys and girls, you little ropers and cowgirls and cowboys. Welcome to Alberta. Now, I don't know if you've ever been told that this place is nothing but ice and snow, but every while and then that ice and snow does thaw, and when it thaws, we get grass that grows as high as a cow's belly. And that comes in right in handy if you're going to feed a cow. Because feeding cows and feeding Canada and feeding even part of the United States, that's what we do here in the Walrun Ranch. And we've been doing that ever since 1894. Ever since the Mounties came out here, and a couple of the Mounties said, you know what, I think we can get rich here on this fat land out here. So Alberta is known for its beef, its steaks, and its hamburgers and such. And the Walrun Ranch was a big part of that. So let's head on in and see what a ranch house looks like. Oh, just wait 1 minute. I gotta see if Cookie's ready for it. Come and get it! Okay, Cookie said we could come in.
That's good. I'm hungry.
Why, I'm so famished that my belly button is touching my backbone. Well, that's okay, because Cookie's here all day. He has this great big oven here, full of wood and sometimes coal, and he's got it hot from sun up to sundown, and sometimes even beyond, and the coffee's always warm. And I always say, Cookie, what's for dinner? And he goes, well, it's hot and it's brown and there's plenty of it. Well, Cookie here, he probably cooks for a string of probably 40 to 50 cowboys, but it's not like they're always here at any one time, because the Walrun Ranch is one huge place. Sometimes that they're off and working out in the corrals. Sometimes they might even be digging spuds for Cookie out here, and other times they'll be off looking for strays, looking for mavericks, maybe fixing some fences here and there. And from what I'm told, some of those Walrun boys would be running off homesteaders too, because they didn't like people up there on the grass range. We didn't like any of them sheep people up here in cow country. Now, the way Cookie did this and made it so efficient with people coming back and forth, well, they didn't worry about taking off their hats or their boots for lunch. They might wash their hands if you can get them to. And boy, with all of these diseases coming around, I hope that they are washing their paws. And they would sit down here, and Cookie would have all of the stew and the beans and the chili and the coffee pot and cream and sugar and utensils and potatoes and such up here on what is called a Lazy Susan.
That's not nice to Susan.
Well, I apologize to Susan, but that's what it's called. Now, we can't get the camera right underneath, but this is an actual wooden wagon wheel under here, and that's why it turns. So you just sit yourself down, none of this passing stuff. We just get whatever's in the middle. Oh, this looks like some good. This looks like some Kool-Aid here. I don't imagine you folks in Kentucky ever seen a jug like that, huh? Well, we see them a lot here in the hills in Alberta. And looky up there. Cookie must have bagged an elk. Oh, that's why those steaks tasted kind of funny last week. And a little gamey, if you ask me. And you'll see a few things on the wall in here. Well, let's go on into the bunkhouse. Hope that they'll... Oh, boys, put them boots back on. Go outside after Cookie feeds you the beans, would you? Well, here we are in the bunkhouse. Well, there's one of the beds, and hopefully we don't catch one of these ratters laying on the bed during the day, because there's too much work to do around here. Well, this is also where we keep our tack. Here's one of our fine Western California stock saddles. Boy, that's in nice shape. I sure wish I could ride on one of those. If I plopped one of these onto a Mustang, I would just be able to fit in there just like I was a Lego man. Well, and here's Wolf. Oh, Cookie, you haven't been feeding us wolf steaks, have you?
I sure hope not.
Yeah, timber wolves were a hard thing back in the hills, and that was one of the cowboys' jobs, to keep varmints from messing with your calves. So coyotes and timber wolves and such, and sometimes even sun bears. Now, when it gets really, really cold in the wintertime, you still have to go out on your horse and check the cattle. And that's where you have a pair of chaps like this. This is like putting another pair of pants on over your other pair of pants. And this helps your britches from getting all tumbleweeds and barbed wire and all such. And you can see this has got hair in it, so this will help to keep your legs warm. I've heard tell that there was even sheep stuff, that sheep wool that they would put on chaps, and you'd never see a sheep on my legs. And you can see some of the paintings in here from my good friend Mr. Charles M. Russell of Great Falls, Montana. And Charlie, he was quite the artist. Why, it was noted that in the Mint Saloon in downtown Great Falls, he'd be sitting there with a ball of beeswax, and he'd make himself a sculptor of a Blackfoot fella. And somebody came along one day and says, "How much for that, Charlie?" And he said, $100. And he said, "I'll give you 50. So Charlie went and says, "Sold." And then he took the whole beeswax thing and he smashed it down and he put it into the ball of beeswax. You couldn't tell it was a sculpture anymore, and he cut it in half. He put the other half aside, and he took the other smaller half and he made the exact duplicate of what he had just done. And it was half as big, and then he said, "Sold." Charlie was that talented. Now, this is an interesting... Cowboys live and die on their ropes. You better know how to do rope if you're going to be a cowboy around here. And this sort of a rope is actually made from the tail of a horse's hair. So they would gather up when they're grooming their horses, they would save all of the hair. And times was in the winter time, they would spend their time weaving that into a rope. And boy, this is tough. It's bristly to the touch. I wouldn't want to rope with this too much, and I wouldn't want to be a calf getting roped by this, because it's really scratchy. And I also heard, so that's what things are like here in the cowboy. Oh, I got to show you this. These are called brands. what a brand is, it's like a signature or a tattoo that every horse and every cow has to have in Alberta, and that's the law. And the reason is we have to be able to prove who owns what cow. And some of these brands have been around here in the families for 120 years. I'm going to show you a branding iron. This is put into the fire until it gets red hot, and then we let it cool a little bit, and then we put it right on the animal. And does that sound like it's cruel? You darn tootin' it's cruel. You want to get branded?
No.
Well, I'll tell you, it's sort of the law, and if you don't do it, well, people can steal your animals and you can't prove it. And it's still done to this day, although we tend to use things like chips put into ears and ear tags and things like that as well. We don't brand as much, but it still happens. But it's the only way to proven way to prove ownership, because the chips can get hacked into and the ear tags can get lost. And usually, the animal, after he's been branded, after a couple of days after, doesn't even remember what happened. I know, I've asked a few. Now wash up and comb your hair if you're in here, pal, because this is the boss's house. This is the manager's room. He's got an office right next to us, and he and his wife live in the bedrooms up to the side, and his children in the bedroom off to the corner. And this is sort of the parlor where he dines, and Cookie also serves him, but separately. He doesn't eat with the riffraff over there. And look at this, he's got a few heads on the walls. Well, look, there's one of the steers from the ranch. That's a Hereford. And if you think he's impressive, wait till we get to the next room. Now in here we have a lot of pictures from back in the ranching days. There's a lot of photographers came out here. And what I want to show you in particular, maybe you have heard of the world famous Calgary Stampede. Still goes on every July except for, well, 2020. But it's been going on ever since 1912. And the reason they had the Stampede back in those days was every cowboy liked to sit around and brag about who was the best bucking horse rider and who was the best roper and who had the most meanest horses and who had the orneriest steers. And then they would all have competitions on how to ride them. Well, a fellow from Wyoming came up here in 1912 named Guy Wiedeck, and he got some money together with some local ranchers, and he wanted to form the biggest rodeo that the world had ever seen, and to this day it still is. And that is the Calgary Stampede. And here is a great panoramic view of all of the riders and ropers of the Stampede. Now today in the rodeo, if you're going to ride a bucking horse, all you have to do is stay on him for 8 seconds, and then they judge you. No, we're real judgy in the rodeo business. But that was kind of, I'll tell you, the old fellows like Emery Le Grandier, and that is a French name. Yeah, he was a French cowboy from Pincher Creek. Here's his boots. He rode in the Calgary Stampede a lot. He was a world champion. He would have thought that 8-second rule was pretty darn wimpy. Because in his day, you got on there and you didn't stop and you didn't get judged until the horse stopped bucking. You actually had to ride it until it tamed down and got tired on you. And then they'd worry about judging you. So rodeo's a little different this time. Nobody's got that kind of time. So now we have the 8-second rule. Troop, fall in! I have some young recruits from Kentucky came from the United States to join the Northwest Mounted Police. I don't think you're man enough. I don't think you could be a Canadian Mountie. Let me show you about what it's in for. First of all, the stars and stripes that you've looked at and you've waved at the 4th of July, gone! You will be loyal to that flag only. That is the flag of Queen Victoria, the Union Jack. And as long as you are on the Queen's soil, You will salute that flag and no other. Is that understood? Thank you. Let's go into the detachment and see what's happening. You have heard of the famous Royal Canadian Mounted Police, those gentlemen in red coats and those funny Stetsons that march around. Well, their origins happened right here in southern Alberta when some nefarious whiskey traders from the United States, and a few Canadian ones as well, just to be fair, were trading with the Blackfoot First Nations people of this area and not treating them very fairly. By not treating them very fairly, it meant that they were trading things like liquor and whiskey and working on their addiction of alcohol in order to get their buffalo hides, which were very, very valuable, which you have heard Kootenai Brown talk about earlier. Well, we tend to get a little upset when Americans try to do things on Canadian soil in Canada without our say-so. So in response, the Northwest Mounted Police was formed, and that's the original name for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because this was called the Northwest. This is a corporal, and yeah, he's not wearing his resplendent red coat today because he is basically in mufti or on post duty. So his red coats would be stashed away so that it would be used on a better occasion. If he was out riding on patrol, generally you would only be able to tell from his headgear or his pants and boots that he was a Mountie. The red coats, they tended to not wear them quite as much as they had to if they didn't have to, if they weren't on parade or if an officer wasn't in the area. This is called an outpost, and you may be familiar with the term of precinct. If you get a big area that has a lot of a very big area that needs policing, and southern Alberta is huge, the main post was a place called Fort McLeod, and it would have several little precincts called outposts, also known as detachments, where if you needed trouble, if you were a pioneer and somebody was stealing your horses, or if you were a First Nations person and you wanted to complain about a whiskey trader, or if you thought somebody was going to be jumping the border, or even if it was things like a prairie fire, or even an emergency, the Mountie was here to help you. And now inside this detachment, and it's a very small building, you will see several of the red coats. And they are in what we call kit order. So at the beginning of the day, when they arose to do their morning duties, their uniforms would be put in kit order so that you knew what it all was. For headgear, there was the pillbox hat. There was also the Stetson, which is good in sun and wind. And also you might be wearing what I'm wearing, and I'm going to say this word very carefully. It's called a pith helmet. P-I-T-H, a pith helmet. I did not say what you think I said. In the winter, you might wear the toque. That's called a toque. I realize you might call it a knit cap. Well, we call it a toque. And we would also, what Mounties like to wear as well in the winter time, is what we call the rat hat. And it is actually made from a muskrat. That's an animal that lives in our wild ones. And no, it's not a rat from the city. But they would call it a rat hat. And buffalo jacket would also be very used in very, very cold days. And I'm going to pan over to here. And on not so cold days, you would wear the wool navy pea jacket. And that's just similar to what you might, British sailors might be wearing on a boat as well. Now, I need to walk over to the prisoner. If I was to catch some miscreant on the prairies, doing some nefarious deeds like being caught with some cattle that he could not prove that had been branded under his brand, I would bring him into here. And the Mounties had the power of a judge. That means that they could ask the person if he was guilty or not, and if he denounced himself guilty on a misdemeanor, on a very small charge like just theft, they could pay a fine and they could go on their way. If they could not pay their fine, they received some foot jewelry. And they would sleep in this bed until they had worked off their fine. And by working, well, this stove needs wood to burn, and they'd be out doing the cutting up of the trees into nice small pieces like that. Or cleaning up behind the mounted police's horses. And believe me, you do not want to do that. Are there any questions? I did not think so. Thank you for coming in to my Northwest Mounted Police outpost. Kootenai Brown and the fur trade and Mounties and farmers and ranchers, cowboys. Now what do you suppose actually is the origin of the real town of Pincher Creek? Such as, where did you get a strange name like that? You could have called it Walnut Creek. You could have called it anything else. What is a pincher? Well, I'm going to get to that. There is a man that came from a place that's not too far away from you. His name was William Samuel Lee. We'll just call him Lee for now on. And he came from a place just across the river from you in Ohio. So there was several people that did come from the United States to come to this area. And we've showed you earlier on the map how you'd have to get here. Many came up the Missouri River, so they would have went to the Ohio, to St. Louis, and then to switch to the Mississippi, and then up the Missouri River, and they would have come all the way to a place called Fort Benton, Montana. And from there, they had many different pursuits. And one of the things that was happening during the Civil War in Montana, they weren't fighting the Civil War in Montana. They were doing other fun things, like looking for gold.
What was that?
Gold!
One more time, I can't hear you.
Gold! Eureka! Anyway, one of those people was William S. Lee, and he'd been out here before. He'd been to the San Francisco gold rush. That's what I mean. Say out here means past the Mississippi. Everything's out here to you guys. And he, like Kootenai Brown, he worked his way up the mountains to different gold rushes until he got to Montana. And the fellows in Montana goes, you know what? Look up north, those British possessions. Not a lot going on up there. If there's gold here, there must be gold up there. So Lee and several other guys, they got on their mules and their horses, and they put a lot of pack mules together, and they just came up prospecting. And if you ever saw pictures of what a prospector looks like, usually an old grizzled guy with a beard down to here, and he's usually got a pick over his shoulders, and they're looking for gold and wherever they can find it. And usually when they're up in the mountains like we are here and in the foothills, they'll look in whatever creek they could. One of the creeks they came to was very close to Kootenai Brown Pioneer Village here. And they would build something like this called a sluice box. And they would take sand and gravel out of that sluice box, or out of the creek, and they would put it in here along with water. They would bend right over in the creek, and then they would see a piece like that. Go! Eureka!
Eureka!
I'm rich! I'm socially secure! Yippee! I don't have to work anymore! Well, William S. Lee didn't get to say that much around here. He never found any gold. In fact, he lost something.
Dun dun dun.
This is a horseshoe. It is worn by a horse. And it is very needed when you're in the mountains, going up and down slopes and things like this. They help your animal to get traction as they're walking along. Without them, their feet get very tired and very sore after a while. And you need certain tools to put these shoes onto their soles. You need hammers, and you need something like this. This is used to cut the nails that go through these right here. These are nail holes that go into the actual horse's hoof. And don't worry, it doesn't hurt the horse. The horse doesn't feel it. He doesn't have any feelings in his hoof. And like I said, we're trying to help him. And sometimes these things get wore down and they get ground down, and you have to put new shoes on. And you have to cut the nails and pull it out. And that's why you use this called a pinça. A pinça. Except we have funny ways of saying things between our two countries. In other words, when you guys say Pincher Creek, you probably said Pincher Crick. Yeah, Canada and America have these funny things that are different from each other. We're pretty close to the same, and one of them is pincer and pincher. It's spelled P-I-N-C-E-R. Except one of these days, somebody, American, would say pincher instead. And somebody put an H in front of it. Look it up in the dictionary, it doesn't have an H. Look it up in your Canadian Wikipedia, Pincher Creek is spelled with an H. So they just kind of used the phonetic thing. William S. Lee, unfortunately, have you ever dropped something and forgotten about it? Forgot where you put it? That's what William Lee did one day, and he lost it. But William Lee didn't lose just his pinchers. He did find something else. He found that he really liked southern Alberta, and he stayed here until his death in 1899. He became one of the biggest ranchers of the area, and he had several children in the area and became one of our earliest settlers. And guess what? When the Mounties came in 1878, 10 years after he'd lost these, guess what they found?
What did they find?
They found his pinchers!
Yay!
And we are now Pincher Creek. And in fact, you'll see some video that I'm going to shoot a little later on that'll show you a giant pincher. And we're really proud of that word. Eureka! Okay, we're in front of a sod hut. If you need a temporary house and you need one right away, like you have just given a deed to a piece of land to homestead on, one of the things that you have to do is to build a house on that land very, very quickly. Because number one, you need to live in it. Number two, that's part of the agreement to get in that land. You are supposed to build a house. So one of the easiest ways you can do it out on the prairie is to take a plow and cut the prairie up like sod, just like you were going to put sod on your lawn. And you put one on top of the other like they were Lego bricks. One on top of the other. And along with some planks or some wood that you can get, you can have yourself a nice sod house. And the nice part about it, when it's raining outside, guess what? It's raining inside.
That doesn't sound very nice.
But it can be very warm. In the winter time, when you get the snow banked up against here, that dirt is a very, very good insulator. And it's also very, very cool on a hot day as well. But you know who doesn't find it cool? When you get married and you have children and you have a wife that comes from somewhere else and she has been very patient with you while you've been getting land out in Alberta. And she'll take one look and goes, I'm not living in that abode. And that's when you go and get yourself some lumber and you build yourself a nice house like the Cox house.
So here we are inside the Father Lacombe Hermitage. We have our Father Lacombe over here. Now, I said a few different words that were a little bit funny. When we were outside, we talked about hermitage. Now, I'll get to that in a little bit, but first I'll start by saying who Father Lacombe was. So we have a picture of him here. Our mannequin isn't quite the same, but I think we did a pretty good job. He's very important for...
Significant representation.
He was very important for Alberta's history and in Pincher Creek as well. He was a Catholic missionary, did work all over the province. Several different towns are named after him. We have one particular, Lacombe, Alberta. That's named after him. That's not near here, but it's on its way.
And St. Albert.
And St. Albert, yes. And his most famous work as part of being a Catholic missionary was his involvement with the First Nations and Métis people in this province. And he dealt with different negotiations, in particular between Crowfoot and the Siksika and the Canadian Pacific Railway to see where they can put their railroad, make sure there were negotiations between what was which land so nothing crossed over where it wasn't supposed to be. He also played an important role in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion, as I talked about with A.E. Cox. He ensured the Crowfoot and the Siksika's neutrality, so they didn't join the war. That was a really big part of Alberta's history. But what brings him to Pincher Creek is the fact that the church sent him to start a parish here. Now, it doesn't look like we could have a big group in this parish, in this church, but Pincher Creek is a very large French, Canadian, and Métis community, and many of them are Catholic. So, Catholic Church Diocese up in Calgary said, we need you to start a new church here in Pincher Creek. So that's what he did. And this is where we're standing. Squares of wood. That's where stairs would have connected to the upstairs floor where Father Lacombe actually lived. And that's why it was called a hermitage, because he wanted to retire here in the area because, and I'm completely biased when I say it, it's a beautiful place to live. So he wanted to hermit upstairs, spend his life in the Pincher Creek area. Didn't happen the way he wanted it to. The diocese called him again to continue his work. He had to go back to Calgary. But the parish he founded started to grow. And as you can see around here, we've got some beautiful statuary. Absolutely magnificent. The statues themselves were made in Europe, and their wooden casings were made by local artists. We also have a bronze figurehead of Father Lacombe. So after this church was just not big enough to fill for all of our parishioners, we built a new church in 1901, St. Michael's Parish. These are all the statues from it. It was called the Church of Statues. However, and here we have our altar. We have our different priest traveling case, different things for Mass that he would be able to perform, the vestments. We have our baptismal font we don't have any holy water in it, but it would be used for baptisms. We have our Paschal candle. We have a candle here. This was the Church of Statues, the original St. Michael's Parish.
And times in around 1864 and lived at Fort Edmonton. If you've ever heard of the Edmonton Oilers, well, that's the same place.
Best hockey team.
Sure, whatever. There had been some wars going on over territory, over hunting grounds between the Cree and the Blackfoot First Nations at that point in time. And you'll hear of places like Battleford and the Battle River, and they got their names from that. And we're not too very far from Lethbridge, Alberta, where the last battle between those two First Nations happened in 1870, 150 years ago this year. And Father Lacombe was involved in walking in between two of these groups when they did get into battle. And he apparently took out a Red Cross flag, not the Red Cross that we know of today, but more or less the cross of St.
Andrew, I believe. No, not St. Andrew, St. George. And he walked in between the warring factions. There's bullets flying, arrows, you name it. Wild horses stomping. And at one point, he even took a musket ball to the forehead during this. And the Cree and the Blackfoot were both also impressed by his bravery, that he thought so much of peace that they should stop, that they, well, stopped. And they held negotiations, and within a few years the Cree and the Blackfoot did not war anymore, at least amongst intertribally. So Father Lacombe's a really good guy, neat guy to look into. He's probably one of the most important historic figures in Alberta, and